Meth is a hard one to kick, man, and he was home for, I think it was Thanksgiving. I wasn't home. I was in college far away, so I couldn't return for Thanksgiving. But it was obvious he had been using. And my sister told my mom, we have to call his probation officer. And my mom, being much more of the soft enabler, was very reluctant. And finally, my sister, who's a very aggressive person, just by nature, said, all right, here's the thing. You either call his probation officer right now, or we go up to the funeral home and you're going to pick out a casket. Because if you don't call his probation officer, he will die. And pretty much put my mom in a corner like, okay, I have to call his probation officer. If your style and your personality fit with the client, that's going to lead to the best outcome. And so if you're seeing, if you start seeing a therapist and you give it like 3 solid sessions and you're not feeling some sort of connection, feel free to switch therapists. Oh, we're not at 1 chai a day anymore.
So it's escalated a little bit.
It has escalated, my friend.
The journey continues.
The journey continues.
Tonight we have Schissel on the show. She is a psychologist and a professor, director of clinical training at St. Mary's University. We talk about every intoxicant under the sun, and we laugh about our time at Hazelden Betty Ford Graduate School of Addiction Studies, where I first met her. I took Differential Diagnosis, where we talk about the relationship between substance use and mental health, withdrawal-induced mental health disorders, and all kinds of personal stories and theories about how people recover, whether addiction can be cured, how does it come about, where does it come from, and what to look out for if you are trying things like alcohol for the first time. What are the signs and symptoms that you might be vulnerable to this disease? Without further ado, introducing Schissel. Having a cup of coffee, a glass of wine, eating desserts, all of these things are pleasurable human experiences. And they can also be pathological behaviors. At what point, actually, let's start with, what does pathological mean?
Pathological means some deviation from the norm. And so it is a really broad concept. And that is a really objective concept, because what is the norm? Who decides what is the norm? Who decides what fits into normative versus pathological? And so by definition, it varies from the norm, but what that actually can look like is hugely heterogeneous. It can take the shape of many different things.
So it's cultural.
Cultural, yes. It kind of hits on all of the different levels and all sorts of different social constructs, and even physiological constructs as well, if you think about how we define it. I like how the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 4th and 5th editions added the impairment and distress markers to what it defines as pathological. And so the DSM now tells us that a diagnosis can only be made if it causes marked impairment in some area of the person's life, or if it causes marked distress. And so that's now how I kind of conceptualize it. Is it causing problems, or is it causing you to feel really bad?
Okay, so different types of people look at the behavior of, for example, watching too much porn as pathological or not, based on kind of what cultural group they're in, what side of the spectrum of sex positivity, or how they look at it.
Porn's a great example because it's so divisive. There are so many people who don't think that any porn is acceptable. And so, any sort of porn viewing ends up being considered, quote, pathological, right? But for me as a clinician, if somebody's coming to me saying I have a problem with porn, my question is going to really be, what problems is it causing you in the world, in your life, in your relationships, in your job, and all of those kinds of things, and or what kinds of problems is it causing you emotionally?
Interesting. So I'm going to cut this out. Sorry. There we go. So just because I am concerned with my relationship with, or how certain visible stimulus affects my sexuality, my private, personal kind of relationship with myself, that doesn't necessarily mean I have an addiction.
Not necessarily an addiction, no. I think there's a lot of phases of pathological before one reach. It is a spectrum. It's a little bit of a problem. It's a moderate problem. It's a severe problem. Or I dabble in it, but it's not really a problem. And so I think there are a lot of people who may view porn that wouldn't by any means have a sex addiction. And yet there are people who probably do have some addictive processes around sex that also view porn.
Do you think it could be confused with depression or feeling, the kind of symptoms of depression of being really fatigued or hopeless, or maybe wanting something that's unavailable, and so using and going on negative thought journeys and sort of using those thoughts to try to get what they really want?
I think it can be. I'm thinking of it more from a neuroscience perspective, that porn viewing and associated sex or masturbation would lead to a dopamine increase, and thereby give a person who's maybe depressed a minute or two where they feel a little less depressed.
Dopamine. So it's a really complex relationship going on here. Mm-hmm. It might not just be addiction, but there's a lot of mental health pieces going on.
Mm-hmm. And then if you have something like bipolar disorder, a lot of people when they have mania experience hypersexuality. That's a pretty common part of it. Or trauma. If people have sexual trauma, there are a number of folks who will engage in, and I'm using the term hypersexuality without any sort of definition because I think it's really individually defined, but may engage in a lot of sexual behaviors in some way to psychologically compensate for the past history of trauma. And so sex in and of itself can be a part of many different disorders and how it is that it's used. A lot of times in depression, people are just so anhedonic, so unable to experience pleasure, that I would usually associate depression probably with a decrease in, like, say, porn use or sex interest.
Right.
In fact, that's one of the markers of depression.
And so you mentioned trauma, and part of coping with trauma is to purposely dissociate, kind of get out of your body. Mm-hmm. And maybe hyper-focusing on something sexual might help you, in a way, experience something out of body or not be in your body.
It can be dissociative for some individuals. It can also be about power and dominance for a lot of people. And so if they had sexual trauma where they felt vulnerable and overwhelmed, they may then use sex as a way to feel stronger and more dominant. And so some people with a history of sexual trauma will use it that way. And so it's a very complicated relationship between sex and trauma.
So why do you think someone would abstain completely from any kind of... I know how porn is so accessible these days. Why do you think someone would want to completely kind of erase that from their consciousness and abstain completely from sexual behaviors? Specifically men.
That, I can think of a few reasons. One of them is if they are super depressed and vegetative and they just coping with the idea of sex is just an additional thing that they can't even think about. A second one ends up being a lot of pressure in intimate relationships. And this is from a cis hetero perspective, that many of the men that I've encountered who have decreased or have cut porn out have done so at the request of a female partner, because of how uncomfortable the porn makes them feel. And so for relationship satisfaction, I've seen people cut it out. And then also if people get to the point where the porn use becomes problematic in and of itself, they may choose to cut it out in a way to ameliorate those problems. So if somebody is engaging in porn use in a way that is problematic and potentially addictive, like they're watching porn when they should be working, so they're not getting tasks done, they're not taking care of their kids because they're watching porn instead, all of those kinds of markers of what we consider addiction, then that person may choose to step away from porn and re-examine their life and re-engage in other areas of their life.
And that's healthy for their dopamine system.
It can be. It's about finding ways to release dopamine that don't cause problems in your life. And so if that means that you really like going on a jet ski, that is probably less likely to cause problems for you than using cocaine. And so it's about finding joy in areas of your life that are healthy, that aren't going to cause those problems.
And what drugs would make someone manic?
Would make them appear manic. Typically, those are stimulants. And so cocaine, in its various forms, methamphetamine is the big one. And really any stimulant can make a person appear manic.
Appear manic. Mm-hmm. Do you see people get misdiagnosed a lot?
Yes. A lot of people end up with bipolar disorder diagnoses when they have chemical use disorders. And for many of them, the bipolar diagnosis is not accurate. People who have bipolar disorder do abuse substances at a higher rate than the general population. So we are still going to have a higher rate of folks who have bipolar disorder in the chemically dependent population than in the general population. But it is still not super high. And so you really have to look at the pattern of mood symptoms and the pattern of chemical use in order to make that differentiation. I've had a lot of people say, yeah, I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I think maybe having worked in chemical dependency treatment, and those people come in, maybe 20% of them have actual bipolar disorder. It's usually because, I didn't tell my doctor about all the cocaine I was using. Do you think that had an effect on it? Yes, I think that probably affected the diagnosis.
That is interesting.
Yes.
I was diagnosed bipolar in a hospital, fully intoxicated. Mm-hmm. And whether or not you think I have it today is, I can get very excited about things. But I think that there's within a normal range of excitement and zest for life. And then there is the high energy behavior that lasts for 7+ days with almost no or little sleep. Mm-hmm. And that needs to happen in absence of any chemical use.
Right. Or it's a substance-induced bipolar diagnosis.
Right. That's one of the most interesting things that I've discovered on this journey. It was a very personal thing that I learned in graduate school. Mm-hmm. And it was relief. It was a relief because it's really nice to finally get clarity that substance-induced mental disorders, you can pretty much have almost any mental disorder substance-induced.
Pretty much, for the most part, yes. Mood disorders, different anxiety disorders, even OCD can be related to medication or chemical use, or at least significantly exacerbated by it. It's really significant.
So of all the things and behaviors that feel good in this world, and a lot of people who don't understand would think, oh, why can't you just have a glass of wine? Why can't you just have a cup of coffee? Just one. My doctor said, well, if you're drinking a pot of coffee a day, that's bad. And I said, I can't help myself. What can people get addicted to?
Really anything that causes that dopamine bump. If it causes a dopamine bump, in my opinion, it has the potential for addiction, or at least for misuse. Because people may be chasing that dopamine bump and they want it. And so they may engage in that behavior in order to change how they feel. And that's when we start to get into a gray area in terms of whether it's healthy or not.
That's interesting. So there are these cross addictions, and when people kind of finally get off their drug of choice or quit drinking, which is such a huge life change, a huge reset for your dopamine and a lot of receptors in the brain, including GABA, that calming kind of dominant brain receptor. What happens when people start reaching and grasping for other kinds of things and behaviors as soon as they stop their drug of choice?
I think it ends up being a distraction. And so what is it that they don't want to feel or experience? Or what is it that they do want to feel and they do want to experience? And I think that needs to be part of the conversation. A lot of times people are using chemicals in order to avoid different kinds of uncomfortable feelings. And so it's really important to identify what those uncomfortable feelings are and what else we can do to help manage those feelings.
Do you think there's a way to achieve learning to have a healthy relationship with your dopamine, or learning how to like surf a healthy level of dopamine throughout your daily life for people who suffer from addiction?
I mean, I think it looks different for each person, though. And so some people can have 1 cup of coffee. Some people can have 1 glass of alcohol. They maybe never are able to touch cocaine again, but they may be able to have a glass of wine occasionally with dinner. And if that works for a person, then that seems okay to me. I'm not really aggressive in terms of abstinence only across the board for all of the things, because we do live in the real world and these things are around us, and we do want to be able to experience joy and happiness. And if a person can use something like that, or can gamble a little bit, or shop a little bit and have it not become a problem, that doesn't seem horrible to me. But if a person acknowledges that I can either drink no coffee or I have to drink a pot of coffee, then that may be something where they have to go towards the zero, because they can't control it once it starts.
We live a life story that is like a one-way flight somewhere, and we run through kind of cycles with different things that cause dopamine spikes. And there's a lot of shame in having to let go of a relationship with some substance or some behavior. You know, there's a lot of shame in what they call being pickled. If you're an alcoholic and you've gone so far, leaned so far into daily drinking lifestyle that you have to give it up. And I wonder about that. I wonder about whether it's healthy in your one lifetime to say, I just cannot have a drink again.
It depends on where that one drink leads you. I had a client years ago who the last couple of times he drank over the course of a year, the last 2 instances, one time he nearly died from alcohol poisoning and ended up in the ICU, and the second time he made a very determined suicide attempt. And he came to therapy acknowledging, I can't drink again. I will probably die. I will probably succeed in killing myself the next time I drink. And so if a person gets to that point, or if they have such horrible liver failure that their physician has told them, if you drink again, based on the health and well-being of your liver right now, you you will die. If people are at that point, then, obviously the zero is going to be necessary for them to be able to live and survive. For other people, maybe less so. But I know a lot of people who live in recovery who have the abstinence-based mentality that live very happy lives. And for them, it seems like that's what they needed in order to find that path forward.
It's dangerous for some people, and it causes behaviors and outcomes that I think once they've tested it enough, and people like me, once I've gone through the suffering enough of where that drink leads, I know where that road goes. It's like in the Matrix, where he chooses to get out of the matrix with Trinity because he's like, get in the car, you know where that road leads. That's part of, I think, recovery, that like finally realizing, no, I'm going to train the pathways in my brain not to go down that road today. Do you know where does addiction come from? I've been thinking a lot about prevention and a lot about kind of where addiction starts. Where does it? What can young people avoid doing to not tempt their brains from getting to the point where they're hooked on something?
It is so hard because a lot of this has to do with our genetic makeup and how we're made biologically. Some people will have a drink of alcohol and, at the age of 14 or whatever, and immediately be in love and obsessed with it. Like, where have you been my 14 years of my life? And this is the only thing I ever want forever. And other people will have a drink and will think it's gross and put it down and barely drink at all throughout the course of their lives. And so it's so difficult to predict who is going to be the person who can't put it down again. Obviously, the genetic history of a person is a really important thing to consider. And so if you have a parent or two parents or a significant family history of addiction, that's going to be a huge red flag for a person that maybe they need to be careful. And also consider how it is that your body responds to substances when you consume them. Is it the sort of thing where you like it a lot? Almost too much? Is it something where it feels like it starts to become obsessive really quickly? If that obsession is there, that might be another indicator to a person that they need to take a step back, and maybe that's something that could be dangerous for them.
Okay. So we live in this world of intoxicants, some legal, some not. And so for the young people listening, it's not about trying not to live in this world as it is right now. I know there's something I need to accept about the way the world is, and I'm probably idealist about sort of trying to aim to stay off all intoxicants, including caffeine, because then I'll feel like a god or something. I'll feel amazing and otherworldly, like, or maybe like I felt when I was 15 before I really started daily drinking. But it's about paying attention, maybe even to the tolerance. Like, is your tolerance to alcohol going up quickly?
And what is the reason for wanting to drink? I think that's a big one too, because when it becomes problematic, there's a lot of, I need to drink in order to not feel this way. And that's pretty concerning when you start hearing that language. It's very different when a kid drinks occasionally at a party to have fun. But when all of a sudden I need it because I can't cope with my anxiety, that's a problem.
I remember saying once, being sober is so boring. And my friend immediately reacted, who doesn't have an addiction problem, with, do you have a substance abuse problem?
That was a very insightful friend.
Yeah.
That was a very good response.
Highly intelligent.
Yes.
I think a lot of people recognized it. Maybe fewer people recognized it in me than the friends that did recognize it. But that's because I surrounded myself with people that really wanted to keep the party going. And they loved happy hour. And so if I started to look at my overindulgence in that pleasure, overindulgence in those dopamine receptors in my brain, that maybe they'd have to stop partying, or maybe they would have to let go of me as a friend gradually,
And that's part of what you said before, when removing alcohol from your life is a huge decision that impacts several areas of your life. And that might include, well, all of my friends drink. I have no social network anymore. And that's a really sad place for people to find themselves.
So someone stops drinking, and then they're thrown into this culture of recovery. if whether or not they choose to get a social support system that supports abstinence from that drug of choice, they're kind of shunned from the culture, the mainstream culture of the world, and they have to find this whole new social life in this sort of private, anonymous club, you know? Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you've had people struggle with that whole ultimatum almost. It's like you must now completely change everything.
You have to change everything. And then also, well, what if I do go back to my friends when they have a party and I'm not drinking? They're all going to ask why. And now not only do I have to change everything, but now if I am in any of those similar environments, I now have to explain my existence, why I do what I do, why I don't do what I don't do. And that's a really uncomfortable thing, because when a person chooses to enter recovery, it's usually because things have gotten very bad and they shouldn't have to out themselves every time they want to see people. Trying to explain to people why you don't drink alcohol is a really hard thing to do, because it is so mainstream and so many people drink a lot of alcohol. The whole on Pinterest and everything where you have like mommy special juice, water cups for wine and things like that. Just, they make me cringe so much.
Yeah, that would be an interesting sort of pressure for people. And the advertising and marketing is everywhere, kind of glorifying, glamorizing. I actually think we live in a stage of capitalism that is glitching out because the potency of the addictive stuff that is marketed at us is so high and continuing to get higher and more potent, including social media, and everything on our phones seems to just have gotten more and more addictive. It just pulls my attention and I can't help it. And then the fact of fentanyl being in a lot of illicit pills, not that that's marketing, but it's sort of an example of things that are available to us to buy have gotten so potent because they want to sell it. And the drug dealers have taken that philosophy that comes from capitalism to a point that it's killing their customers.
Right. We've reached dopamine saturation, maybe?
Yeah, I think we've reached this sort of dopamine saturation, and I wonder about, resetting it. I wonder if that's possible. I think it would be healthy to take breaks from things. And it would be really neat to be able to have some kind of maybe like a caffeine-free detox spa where you can go for a while, maybe a couple of weeks, and like totally just sweat it out.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see. There would be a lot of very cranky people there. But yeah, it's interesting because there are so many detoxes and cleanses and all of these things, and they don't really focus on anything, well, in my opinion, useful, first of all. But second of all, they don't focus on things like caffeine or nicotine or alcohol. Well, alcohol, obviously, if you're going to detox from alcohol, you really need a hospital-based place to be medically safe if you are actually physiologically dependent on it. But we don't really have a lot of opportunities for detox from the acceptable substances, do we? That's interesting.
I think the health trend is also selling things like health supplements that can also become so potent they can kind of mess with you, with your microbiome. So in another way, we're getting attacked in our desire to be healthy by getting sold supplements. And that can become kind of another addiction.
It can. And people then, there's the term orthorexia around people who won't eat anything that's not organic and meets all sorts of different kinds of standards. And then they end up developing some kind of disordered eating pattern. Orthorexia is not in the DSM, but it's a term that's gotten thrown around a lot over maybe the last 10, 15 years with people's kind of obsession with health food and health supplements and that kind of lifestyle.
Yeah, and I think it sounds like there's no real true prevention. I mean, a while ago, my stance was the only 100% effective prevention of people, especially high school students and things, dying of fentanyl overdose would be total abstinence. Don't even try it. But also, kind of what you're saying is that we have to accept that we live in this world where there are addictive behaviors and intoxicants. We're all very different. Mm-hmm. Some people might fall into those patterns more than others. And maybe we can learn the signs and symptoms that will help us prevent the damage in the long run.
That would be nice, because the majority of people will try alcohol at one point or another. The majority of people will try substances or will experience different kinds of addictive behaviors. But it doesn't go to addiction for everyone. In fact, those who struggle with addiction long term tend to be in the minority, especially with something like alcohol. And so if it isn't everyone, then it would be nice to be able to acknowledge what those early warning signs were and kind of help people get on a path of recovery or a healthier path earlier.
And so there's a lot of theories about what causes addiction, mm-hmm. where does addiction come from? Mm-hmm. And so while we're talking about prevention and like the early signs, is it true that we just no one really knows for sure?
No one really knows for sure. Like we were talking about before, some of those things where a person will use the first time and immediately know this is something that they love and want to do all the time, I think that's pretty concerning. Or when they're trying to use things specifically to change how they feel, that's concerning. When they're using a substance so much that they can't go to school or work anymore, or they're missing school or work, when it's causing functional impairment, those kinds of things, that's when we start to worry. And yet sometimes by the time we're aware of those things, a person can already be fairly far down the road of addiction. And so it's hard to predict, and it's hard to alter the path really early on.
What would you say to parents who have kids that are already pretty far down that path?
That recovery is possible. I think a lot of parents, there's a certain hopelessness and helplessness that comes out, and which is completely understandable because of how impactful addiction is. But the fact is, the children can learn, adults can learn when they hit a certain point and they realize that this lifestyle isn't doing anything for them, they can make better decisions.
Can it be cured?
Cured is a scary word. I wouldn't say cured. I think it's something that can be managed. For some people who develop really significant alcohol use disorders, they may always have the kind of brain that if they have one drink, they're going to have the whole liter of vodka and there's going to be a whole bunch of problems. And for those individuals, it's good that they go the abstinence route. For other people, they get to a point where they can drink moderately, and that's fine. I just don't know what cured would necessarily mean in those cases. Are you searching for the ability to use in moderation after having developed a problem? Or are you searching for the desire to simply just not use the substance anymore? So I don't even know what cured means.
Well, some people get impatient or frustrated if they have a loved one or they themselves have been to treatment over 10, over 15 times, and they're not getting well. They're not able to abstain from that one substance that's causing them problems. I'm wondering, in your observations in clinical practice, do you think that people are getting proper support in treatment centers?
Insurance has made recovery very dicey sometimes. And you will see people getting removed from residential services who really still need residential services. And especially depending on the kind of substance. I remember a person, can come in, they're dependent on meth, using meth, having meth-induced psychosis, an insurance company is still cutting, 4 or 5 days in when they are still experiencing psychotic symptoms because, oh, it's just meth. They can sleep it off, right? And so, that's madness. That's absolute madness. And so being able to offer people the kind of support they need is really challenging because of a lot of the financial barriers.
So if someone could have enough resources, if they're really in the depths of addiction and they have an ability to get stable housing, adequate mental health support, and like a purpose, either a job, a hobby, or another reason to stay sober, do you think addiction might be able to fade away for that person easier had those are consistently provided?
If a person has those kinds of things, then sure, it's probably going to be an easier road for them. However, the flip side of that is sometimes if a person doesn't actually experience enough consequences from their use, they may not be motivated for that life of recovery. And so loved ones may walk a very fine line between wanting to support them and support their recovery and make all of that possible, and enabling them. And I remember working in residential treatment, there were so many times where parents would swoop in, or loved ones or spouse or whomever would swoop in and say, oh, we'll just, we'll pay off we'll get a really good lawyer and get the DUI dropped, and we'll do this and we'll do that. And those things may feel like helping sometimes, and sometimes they are, but it also may decrease the person's motivation. So there's still this line that you have to manage.
That is interesting. Mm-hmm. It's almost like you need to get kicked out of the house.
You do. Sometimes people need a kick in the butt. And yet you want it to be the most loving kick in the butt possible.
Well, I define love as, M. Scott Peck defines love as anything that pushes someone to grow personally, spiritually, whatever. Mm-hmm.
And you want your kids to grow. And so knowing, do I pay their rent for the next few months while they get sober? Is that helping or harming them? It so depends on the situation. And so if you're able to have contact with the professionals who are working with your child and asking them and seeing what they think, because they'll be able to tell you, oh, you're really enabling. I think they need to have the carpet pulled out from under them a little bit to figure out what they're going to do. Or no, they're doing really good work in their recovery, and for them to continue to have stable housing that you're supporting, that seems like a great thing.
So this is a behavior, and addiction is a behavior that slowly grows and grows over time until it becomes unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And so people get frustrated with the inability for people to form new behavior, to start a whole new chapter in recovery, even though they have a lot of support and treatment. And the problem with addiction treatment, I think, is it is very expensive for insurance to pay for, because they need to be living in a secure facility where they can practice this behavior. It takes time.
Yeah.
People are not kind of fixable machines with parts. People are very multidimensional.
Yeah. It makes me think of someone like Matthew Perry, who has a lot of access to a lot of support, and he continued to struggle maintaining recovery. And I don't know if substances were involved in his death. We won't know. At the time that we're talking now, we don't have any toxicology or anything like that. But there are people who have resources that sometimes can't pull out of it.
A lot of people say the consequences are the thing that make people finally make a change, because they run out of money. And in my case, I spent all of the money that I had at the liquor store for about a year. Oh. And that was kind of the turning point for me when I finally kind of reflected on that. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, okay, something's got to change.
Yeah, that's pretty concerning. If somebody's spending all their money at a liquor store for a year, that's a good time to have a good conversation about it.
But some people never run out of money.
Exactly.
And that's a difficult circumstance in itself.
It is. Again, it's that fine line. You can use all of that money to try to promote recovery, and you can use that money as a cushion when you fall. And you may not experience the same level of consequence other people do.
So what do you think makes people have that transformation, that moment, like I need to take a look at myself and look at this? Is there a certain kind of therapy approach that you would use to help people guide them there?
I mean, it's a really challenging question, because even amongst people who have lots of resources, we talk about Matthew Perry, how many people who are famous are in recovery. There's a lot of them. And so one single lifestyle does not necessarily mean success or failure with recovery. And also one single therapeutic orientation is not going to mean success or failure with recovery. I think it has to do with the fit for the person and what works for them. A lot of times we typically will start with motivational interviewing just to help people clarify what it is that they want in life, what their goals actually are, to kind of understand what the path may look like. But whether you're a CBT therapist or an eclectic therapist, we're not supposed to use that word, integrative therapist, or a psychodynamic therapist or an existentialist or whatever, if it's the fit, if your style and your personality fit with the client, that's going to lead to the best outcome. And so if you're seeing, if you start seeing a therapist and you give it like 3 solid sessions and you're not feeling some sort of connection, feel free to switch therapists. People feel like, no, I really need to, really suffer it out for 6 or 12 months in order to see if this is going to work. And I don't think so. If you're not feeling the connection, if you're not feeling the start of something, then it's okay to change. And those professionals will be okay. You don't have to try to protect their feelings either. So you have to really find the person and the approach that works for you.
Mm-hmm. So what worked for your brother?
The legal system and AA. The legal system can be a highly motivating beast.
Did a judge order something?
Yes, it was a pretty hefty prison sentence or treatment.
Okay, so commitment to treatment is a common thing that I confront in the hospital. People do get stuck in the mental health unit because they're on a commitment and they're kind of out of treatment centers that'll accept them due to behavioral issues. And that's a difficult place to get stuck. Do you believe in more commitment to treatment or freedom? Like what balance?
Well, he was perfectly free to choose prison. I mean, that is a choice.
Okay.
He could have chosen prison. He could have continued to use and ended up in prison because he was on probation for many years. And so those are still legitimate choices. Homelessness is a choice. If you just took that phrase and put it out there, that would sound horrible. So let me back up for a second. So please don't take that out of context. When people are at that stage with addiction, they can choose those things that to us would not feel like choices.
That's the interesting thing when talking about stigma and addiction. An interesting dynamic in addiction is that our behaviors in intoxication tend to be destructive, harmful, humiliating to ourselves, to social norms, reclusive maybe.
Isolative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like it's good to move towards de-shaming and reducing stigma so people can talk about it, so that we can talk about it with kids. Like, this is a sign that, I mean, if you like this a lot, you might want to think about harm reduction or moderation, or really, it would be good if more people were having that conversation.
Yes. If more people could talk about it in a healthy way, and if people could understand it. I think even just the understanding of what addiction is, while I think the general population is better educated than they were maybe 20 years ago, it's still something that a lot of people do not really understand. And it's very interesting the kinds of questions that I get from people who are either newly in recovery or my students. As an instructor, I have taught an addiction elective, or loved ones. I've had a lot of therapy clients who are loved ones of addicts, and so we work a lot around relationships and codependence and things like that. And so people still don't necessarily have people in general don't necessarily have a sophisticated understanding of what it is yet.
Well, I wonder if the cohesiveness of our civilization is interrupted early on in a way that people aren't really haven't quite reflected on before in caffeine use in young children. Mm-hmm. Was something like 80% of children over 2 or 3 exposed to caffeine regularly?
I think so. I think it was at least weekly. I believe that was the figure that we had talked about several months ago.
And I really wanted to do a study. I proposed a research proposal on a longitudinal study on whether caffeine use in children that are regularly exposed to caffeine or given caffeinated beverages like Coca-Cola, mm-hmm. were more likely to be diagnosed ADHD, maybe have difficult relationships with their teachers or parents. I really wanted to kind of look at an entire qualitative kind of vision of kind of the big picture of what's going on in these kids' lives. And I wanted to compare kids that really weren't allowed to have any caffeine and kids that were. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you have any perspective or thoughts on that.
There are a lot of additional factors that could make that kind of work a bit challenging. So you would need a pretty large sample. So first of all, how many things have caffeine in it that we don't know have caffeine in it? And so how much, is it actually more like 99% of children? It's just their parents don't realize that they're having whatever snack that has caffeine in it. So that already is challenging with that, right? And then second of all, for households where no caffeine is allowed for the children, I would wonder if there are then going to be other differences in those homes versus homes that do have caffeine available. One of the first things that I think of is that there are certain religions where substances across the board are banned, right? And so I'm thinking of like Mormon homes, for instance, and those homes are going to be qualitatively different than homes that are not Mormon. And so are there additional factors then in homes that are particularly caffeine avoidant that make them more strict or make them different in a way that varies systematically compared to children who are in homes where caffeine is occasionally allowed? So you would have to also have a fair amount of information in order to be able to account for those additional factors in your statistical analyses.
Yeah, not to bring politics into this, but Mitt Romney looks great for his age. He's so sharp.
I know.
It makes you wonder, that good quality sleep.
Like it kind of does.
Decades and decades of compound interest on your sleep.
Yes.
It might be, one of the greatest sleep researchers who wrote Why We Sleep says that sleep is nature's greatest attempt at our immortality. Mm-hmm. And we should be prioritizing sleep more, especially I think in kids. So my theory is a lot of kids consume too much caffeine mm-hmm. and end up with an ADHD diagnosis. And then they get put on prescription drugs and stimulants that are much stronger than caffeine. And I wonder if a lot more people could be on a lot less drugs just because of our inability to give caffeine a good, honest look in the eye.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a viable theory. I think it's really interesting, a very interesting question. What is it that our ADHD diagnoses are really high? And people are so quick to diagnose ADHD, or at least to try to promote, like, oh gosh, these children are they're too active. They must have something wrong with them. It must be ADHD. And so that's another thing in chemically dependent folks. I get a lot of them saying they have historical diagnoses of ADHD. And I totally believe ADHD exists. I just don't necessarily know if it exists to the degree to which it's diagnosed, because I see poor diagnostics around a lot of ADHD diagnoses. Similarly, I see poor diagnostics around a lot of folks who have bipolar disorder as well.
That psychological testing for ADHD has to be several different environments. It's a lot, right? It's a big test.
There's a lot of tests involved to really rule things out because, as I tell my students, inattention is literally a symptom of everything. Mm-hmm. And so is this child inattentive because they're distracted by their anxiety and they have an anxiety disorder? Or are they depressed? Or are they showing early signs of bipolar disorder? Or are they using substances? Or are they developing disordered eating and they can't focus because of lack of nutrition? Or do they not have access to enough food? And so they are showing signs of lack of nutrition. There are so many reasons why people are inattentive. And so for people to assume that all inattention ends up being ADHD is erroneous at best and dangerous at worst. And so people really should be evaluated in a comprehensive way to make sure that the ADHD diagnosis is correct. I've had many people who a brief questionnaire is all that's given. And then they're given an ADHD diagnosis and they're given stimulants. And it's just, as a psychological practitioner, that's very concerning because it should be a much more in-depth process.
Inattention. Mm-hmm. I have tried so hard in so many ways to quit caffeine because I sleep so much better. I think I'm just one of those people that's really sensitive to it.
Mm-hmm. Some people are.
I just feel sleep at a level of intensity. I'm just extremely sensitive to the pulse of my sleep, I guess, that I know when I've had a really shallow sleep that's been kind of bathed in caffeine. And,
right.
When I quit for those 4 months, I was reading more and just clearer. And I think I was still in withdrawal. It's a long withdrawal. Mm-hmm. So it's also a complete life change. Not as intense as quitting alcohol was, but
right.
It's a very different way to live. You need to trust that you're going to have enough energy, mm-hmm. That you're not just going to fall asleep, or not that I never fell asleep. I never just fell asleep. So if you're trying to quit caffeine, I mean, you might be okay. But having to trust that my natural body would summon enough focus energy, because mm-hmm. caffeine gives you that spotlight focus. Mm-hmm. But the weird thing is, I started to relapse on caffeine. I started to reintroduce it into my life, and I notice now if I have just a very low dose of coffee or something like that, my focus is all over the place. It's inattention. It's inability to really focus. And I think it's partly like my body's reaction to it as I get overwhelmed by it now. And my brain wants to go everywhere, like every direction.
Yeah, it is. And for me, caffeine, I'm not particularly sensitive to the effects. I can drink a pot of coffee and go right to bed. You're like my roommate. Yeah.
I'm jealous.
I can do that. And I used to drink a lot of coffee. When I was an undergrad, I was up to 9 cups a day. I would make them 3 cups at a time, and I would drink 9 cups a day. There was another period, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where I got back up to like 8 to 10 cups a day again. And at that time, I started having some like pain, abdominal pain. Because coffee is highly acidic.
Me too.
I mean, it hurts. And so I was no longer that undergrad who could drink 9 cups a day without thinking twice about it. And I had to cut back. And at that time, I think I cut back to maybe 3 cups a day again.
Yeah, I think as I get older, I'm changing. My reaction to mm-hmm. that particular substance changes. Mm-hmm. My desire to prioritize my sleep and seek immortality is increasing. And so I kind of think, I wonder, what would you think of this concept that people just, like people age out of mental disorders, sort of? There's a study that shows antisocial personality disorder sort of gets more mild as people hit 50 or above. Maybe the incentives for that kind of sociopathic behavior go down. The motivations aren't really there at that age, perhaps. They can't access the kind of people that they would normally harm. I also wonder, like, do you think we could age out of addictions?
Potentially, depending on how body chemistry may change over time. I mean, the dangerous thing with looking at something like antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, both of them follow a similar trajectory where by middle age, the majority of people no longer meet full criteria. And there are a few reasons for that. And the dangerous part of it is that for a number of folks, they don't survive to middle age. ASPD and borderline personality disorder, folks tend to die violently from either accidents, fights, suicides. With borderline, it tends to be more suicides. And then with antisocial personality, more fights, accidents, risky behaviors and things. So part of it is simply they don't survive. And then the other part of it oftentimes is simply antisocial behaviors take a lot of energy. And by the time you get to middle age, you don't have enough energy to be antisocial anymore. And so while they're declining, they're not necessarily declining for great reasons. With borderline personality disorder, it might be better reasons because we have dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, which really reduces a lot of the symptomatology and a lot of the problems associated with borderline PD. So with borderline PD, it might be for positive reasons because we do have really great treatment. And when you have BPD and you're so miserable and you really want to make those life changes, DBT is great, right? But especially for ASPD, we don't have great treatment options. And so the reasons why people age out of the behavior is they die or they're too tired.
I wonder what kind of treatment would, like in dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, it's really helpful for people to learn communication skills and learn how to kind of get past things and get past this sort of vortex of anxiety and worry. And also, I just can't let go of this situation in my life. I cannot accept it, cannot move past it. So you keep kind of re-experiencing a really uncomfortable emotion by thinking that thought that like triggers the stress. And people learn how to get past things. People learn to accept, all right, let's just move on. Yeah. Let's like let that person communicate to me the way that they do. And I will use my skills to incentivize when I want something. You know, I think a lot of this is just being unskilled at asking for what you want and thinking you need to manipulate people.
Well, and for a lot of folks who have borderline personality disorder, their family of origin was oftentimes chaotic and or abusive. Not always, but a lot of times there was chaos and abuse or neglect present. And so they learned that they had to manipulate or they had to experience life in a certain way. They had to react in a certain way in order to get their needs met. And DBT is really this opportunity to say, that's not how all relationships have to be. You can actually bolster your interpersonal effectiveness, your strategies, and be straightforward with people and get your needs met. And if they do not respond well to you being upfront and honest and straightforward, then maybe you need to set some healthy boundaries.
Right. And there's also these skills of, okay, I don't get to have what I want. And okay, this person isn't going to do what I want them to do. So there's these emotion regulation skills of how to de-escalate my inner dialogue and get past things. And it's a really good therapy. I wonder for antisocial personality disorder if those kinds of we could think of practicing empathy or educating about harm or outcomes. It would be difficult.
The hard part is the motivation. Excuse me. Folks who have borderline personality disorder suffer. They suffer so much and they're so unhappy in many cases. And so they are motivated for DBT. And DBT is a lot of work. Adherent DBT, I think, is a full 2 years, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but I think it is about that. And so you are asking a lot for people to do. But for people who are so miserable, they're willing to do it. Folks with ASPD don't tend to be as miserable. It's more, I don't have a problem. Other people have problems. They have problems with me, but I'm fine. I'm happy. I'm good. I get my needs met. And so we have a motivation problem with them.
They're thinking mostly about themselves.
Yeah.
So is there anything that we can do in Minnesota or anywhere in the world to help people with substance use disorders? Can the general public do something to ensure that we get proper support and funding for services?
It's such a hard question. I think a lot of it is really policy driven because it's about access and it's about funding. We have a lot of useful treatment modalities. There's a lot of therapy that is available. There are a lot of different therapeutic orientations that can be helpful. A lot of treatment centers with different ideas and different approaches. People can try a lot of different things. But finding access and funding for those services is really hard for people. Even if you have insurance, you're still going to be limited on what you can do.
Yeah, so insurance sort of cuts people off, and in the bigger picture, we're up against a lot of different variables in trying to treat addiction and form healthier behaviors and have this life transformation, this inner transformation that makes you a lot more introspective. Maybe is it being introspective? Is there anything that quality or kind of pattern, a behavioral pattern a person might have that makes them more likely to get it the first time?
That's a great question too. And I'm trying to think through folks who have kind of done one treatment and been done with it and had lasting sobriety from that and what kind of characteristics they may have. And I mean, I think introspection and an ability to engage in insight can be really helpful. And yet sometimes people for the first year or two just simply have to focus on a behavioral regimen and can't think past that behavioral regimen for quite a while either. Whereas other people really have to do a deep dive in terms of their spirituality and their sense of meaning and things like that early on for them to get to the next phase. And so it's really hard to even acknowledge what those factors may be. But I think finding meaning is probably one of the most important parts of an addict's recovery. And I think that's one of the most important parts of life in general for all of us, regardless of whether we have addiction.
I think that's why I'm an existential therapist. Mm-hmm. I run groups sometimes pretty frequently on 2 East. It's the second floor of a hospital unit. It's the only inpatient hospital level of care in the state of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And I started a group there once because there's this layer of suffering. We have had to have suffered, especially to get on a unit like that.
Yep.
And the criteria for substance use disorder in the DSM-5 are suffering. They're full of human suffering kind of behaviors and patterns and things that happen in your life. I mean, withdrawal is the hell that I say we all go through. But the beginning of one of my existential groups was I actually tried this logotherapy technique of we're in the fight for our lives in this room right now, and we're losing. What is your unique, unfinished business in this life? Why are you still in this fight for the rest of your life?
Yeah.
To have a good life, something that looks healthy for you. And it's really interesting to get everyone's unique kind of perspective on their purpose. Mm-hmm. I love running a group like that, but it can also make everybody cry. So it's risky.
It is a risky one. And But with addiction, once it gets to a certain point, it is a life and death kind of situation. When my brother first entered recovery, he did return to use very early on, and got kicked back to treatment.
Meth is one of the toughest ones.
Meth is a hard one to kick, man, and he was home for, I think it was Thanksgiving. I wasn't home. I was in college far away, so I couldn't return for Thanksgiving. But it was obvious he had been using. And my sister told my mom, we have to call his probation officer. And my mom, being much more of the soft enabler, was very reluctant. And finally, my sister, who's a very aggressive person, just by nature, said, all right, here's the thing. You either call his probation officer right now, or we go up to the funeral home and you're going to pick out a casket. Because if you don't call his probation officer, he will die. And pretty much put my mom in a corner like, okay, I have to call his probation officer. And it was kind of funny because he came back complaining that his ex-wife had called the probation officer. And my mom and sister had to say, no, we did, because we know you'll die.
Those are some strong boundaries.
Those are very strong boundaries.
How did it feel to do that for a loved one?
It really was heartbreaking for my mother, because all she wanted was for him to be healthy. And so for her to have to do something like that was just, I think that was a really devastating moment for her. And I think it was probably a devastating moment for him to know that he had put her in that position.
So how about you today? Can you have just one cup of coffee?
No.
Did you figure it out?
No, it's funny. So I had to have a total gastrectomy 1.5 years ago. And so I had to wean myself off of everything, including coffee. I could only get down to 1 cup a day before the surgery. I figured I was going to go through the rest of the withdrawal when I was in the hospital. And after the gastrectomy, once I got to the point where I could, consume things again and eat and drink and such, I tried to drink coffee, and now I cannot stand the taste.
Interesting.
After about 30 years of living on coffee, my body said, no, thank you. So now I drink chai tea. Chai tea is redundant. So now I drink chai. I live on chai.
When you were drinking coffee heavily, it was when I met you at Hazelden Betty
Probably.
Ford.
Yeah.
And did anyone in the workplace notice there might have been a substance use disorder? Or?
I do remember I was complaining about something in my life. And one of my coworkers, we were on the van pool to work. And she said something about how that resentment that I had about that situation, that I should quit caffeine and come to a 4-step with her and 4-step the shit out of that, I think was her phrase. Sorry for the
That's okay.
cursing, but
we're explicit.
Yes, we're explicit. Okay.
I would like to be clean, but it doesn't matter.
Well, to quote this coworker, that was what she said about it. So she had made that comment as a joke, but I don't think anyone had ever said anything otherwise. And that was more driven about me complaining about a graduate school situation that had stressed me out and made me angry.
That's funny. And I think, combination of sleep deprivation and just the effect of caffeine, especially coffee, for me, that is the ultimate form of caffeine. It does something a lot more than tea does for me. And I notice I'm cranky when I've had some coffee.
Interesting. Again, I'm not very sensitive to the effects, but I drink a lot less caffeine now than before my surgery. So I had to have my entire stomach removed. That's a total gastrectomy. And I have been told by my dietitian that I'm not supposed to consume any caffeine because it is a stomach irritant. And without a stomach irritant, it can cause lesions in my intestines. I did unofficial research looking through a Facebook group of people who have my condition that leads to gastrectomies. And I surveyed like 80 people, and none of them have had any intestinal lesions. And most of them drink more caffeine than I do. So I am choosing to drink my chai and be happy because after my surgery, there are not a lot of things I can consume anymore that make me happy.
You're a true addict. It's No, I think that's really interesting.
Yes. And so I have decided that it is a risk that I am taking. And actually, I could not buy the specific chai that I like yesterday at the Target that I went to. So when I leave here, I have to go to a super Target and hope that they have it in stock. Because I'm down to half a bottle of my chai concentrate that I drink.
Must replenish the supply.
We must replenish the supply.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't have enough the next morning. I'd be up worrying. Oh, that was another thing I was going to say about anxiety and kind of aging out of anxiety. And I noticed that I hit a point in my early 30s at some point falling into a pattern of circular thinking. Some call it mind fucking, or over worrying, or overthinking a situation, or just being really disappointed. That kind of stress and anxiety. There was a certain point and a certain transformation, and I don't know when it hit, that I just didn't want to get into it anymore.
Yeah.
And so I kind of think that those mental pathways as we age possibly might naturally, or maybe if we're doing the work, if we're doing meditation, if we're doing a lot of healthy healing, yoga, whatever that looks like for you, something happens. There's a shift. There is a way to kind of evolve out of it.
I think perspectives shift as we get older, and there are some interesting research articles on personality changes associated with age, and people tend to become more agreeable. So that's one of the big five. Agreeableness is one of the big five personality characteristics. And one of the findings is that people just get more agreeable as they age. Like, this fight just isn't worth my energy. I'm gonna be over here and just chill and enjoy my life. And I think that's part of what happens, is that we decide what's important to fight about and what's not.
Okay. So if you want to start a revolution, you need to go find the young people.
Probably.
They are the ones that have the energy.
Yes. To still be antisocial and violent.
Well, not that kind of revolution. But, if you want to change something about the world, you need to find a lot of people that you can get stuck in this inability to accept that thing. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a good thing for some revolutions.
Mm-hmm. It definitely can be. There is a place for that kind of youthful vigor and idealism. Mm-hmm.
And do you think I'm being too idealist that if I cease caffeine, my final intoxicant, which some argue isn't even really an intoxicant because it just kind of decalibrates your brain to sleep cycles. It just kind of removes sleep pressure, or removes that ATP in your brain, or whatever it is that builds up that makes you go to sleep at night. It removes your fatigue, I guess. But if I remove caffeine and live perfectly naturally the way nature designed me to function in a 24-hour cycle, I would maybe be able to levitate. I mean, am I being too idealist that I think I'm going to feel just great and somehow have renewed adrenal glands and be able to kind of feel much younger again?
I mean, the proof is in the pudding. You felt great for those 4 months. Right?
I did. I feel a lot better, even into the evening. It's really weird. I have way more energy in an afternoon, evening that I've not had caffeine, because I guess I'm not coming down off anything, and I'm not sleep deprived. And so there's something that builds up in my body as the day goes on that, but I also think caffeine is a soft landing if you're used to hitting your dopamine in a cycle of alcoholism. If you're used to getting that pleasure every night from drinking or morning, it eventually turned into drinking in the morning for me, or in the middle of the night to get back to sleep. That dopamine kind of relationship of using a substance outside of my body to hit the dopamine, I think that makes it easier to quit drinking. And so I wonder if AA would even be successful without a pot of coffee.
I think that's a really interesting theory, between caffeine and nicotine, both because both are so frequently associated with meetings. When I think about meetings from the 50s, I think about a bunch of men sitting around smoking and drinking coffee, right? Now you have to go outside to smoke, obviously. But if they didn't have those alternate forms of substances, if they had to be abstinent from everything, would they have managed? I remember in our treatment facility where the two of us met, they tried to ban coffee, I think at one point, from both employees and clients. And the problem was actually more from the employees because they started making coffee like without permission. So they ended up being rogue coffee makers and dealers, and they destroyed a bunch of the plumbing because they were flushing grounds down the toilets.
Wow, I didn't know you shouldn't do that.
Well, especially if you have enough grounds, it's probably going to cause a problem.
They were having a lot of coffee.
They were having a lot of coffee. And so if you try to remove those, and I know that it's also something where they're trying to remove nicotine as well and not wanting clients to smoke in treatment. And that is also a battle, even though there are data that indicate if you quit smoking, when you quit drinking or whatever your drug of choice is, you actually increase your likelihoods of remaining sober.
That is interesting. That study about ceasing nicotine and your drug of choice at the same time. And I really want to study with caffeine, but they would never let me take the coffee away from Hazelden Betty Ford, or for that matter, the hospital unit where I work.
No. I mean, you can't take my chai away. The dietitian has tried, and look at how successful she's been.
Patients have complained that they're not getting their creamer right, like the right amount of sweetener or whatever.
Yes.
So that would be dicey.
It would be dangerous. That would cause a revolution.
And also, that is a cause to care about on any addiction treatment unit, the coffee.
Yes.
And also the warning sign that you previously mentioned, that it is possible for you to drink so much caffeine that it can interfere with your professional life. People have lost jobs because of it.
You could be very agitated if you're very sensitive to it, or if you can't get your caffeine and you're in caffeine withdrawal and you're cranky and have a headache and say something you shouldn't. I suppose, those could be things that could happen.
Or you're hogging too much free coffee.
Or you're hogging too much free coffee. That could happen too.
And how do you feel today now that you're down to one chai a day?
Oh, we're not at one chai a day anymore.
So it's escalated a little bit.
It has escalated, my friend.
The journey continues.
The journey continues. We're up to a few.
And that's perfectly normal from anything that I hear.
Yeah. I mean, I have never used anything other than caffeine. I'm one of those rare unicorns that... For me, I took a drink and I hated the way it made me feel, so I never went back. Never smoked a cigarette, never touched anything. Caffeine is as much as I need. So it never has escalated to anything else problematic, but it may cause intestinal lesions. We'll see.
But do you feel better than the 9 cups a day of coffee?
I mean, I think I do. Yeah, I definitely do, because, again, getting older, my GI system couldn't handle that much acid like it could when I was 20, right? And so... I don't have those GI symptoms, that pain that I was having when I got up to a lot.
And it's interesting, there is this ancient Vedic wisdom about high acid diets kind of causing you to not be so spiritually in tune, and having an alkaline diet allowing you to kind of transcend. And I mean, as I get older, I kind of think, the Japanese sort of have it right. They have a very alkaline diet in general, and mild, and also not too much.
Mm-hmm. Isn't there some Japanese island where like 30% of the people who live there are over 100 or something?
The Blue Zone, I think.
Yeah, is that it? Okay.
There's a documentary on Netflix called The Blue Zone.
Okay.
Yeah. I haven't watched it, but yeah, I'm absolutely sure that there is.
I remember reading something like that, and with their diet and their activity levels, they're as close to Mitt Romney, I guess, is Mitt Romney's immortality as any of us can be.
What's your favorite thing about the kind of work that you do as a psychologist?
Oh, I am now more in a role in education. So I am a professor and a director of clinical training. And so I do less direct client care now than I used to. I do some, but I do less. And so for me, teaching is really where my heart is at. In fact, that's how we met.
Right.
Many years ago.
That was the most fun class.
Excellent. Did you also learn things?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I learned a lot and I talked a lot.
That's great. I mean, when you have a class with only like 7 or 8 people, if people aren't willing to talk a lot, it's going to be a brutal class.
Oh, yeah. I had the time of my life in grad school. It was really great. It's really interesting to learn about differential diagnosis, learn, how substance use affects mental health, how withdrawal affects and causes a lot of mental health symptoms that aren't they don't necessarily naturally occurring in your brain, but it's fascinating to me that the removal of daily use of alcohol from your brain can cause such severe psychosis and other things.
Yeah, and death. It can cause death. Alcohol being one of the most dangerous substances to withdraw from. And it's terrifying, really, if you think about that.
How does it cause someone to die?
I think a lot of times, isn't it related to seizure activity, I believe?
Yes, elevated. From what I know, alcohol kind of artificially activates or stimulates your GABA receptors over time. So if you daily drink, you're atrophying those GABA receptors, which are the calming receptors, the most dominant receptors in the brain. And if you remove alcohol, the balance of the receptors in your brain is so off that your glutamate it goes up so high it can cause you to be overstimulated by reality and start to hallucinate. And then also things are firing so much in your brain, it can cause seizures, which ultimately cause you to not breathe enough oxygen. And so what I understand is that the seizures cause low enough oxygen levels that eventually you have a stroke or you die, something like that.
That sounds right. Because GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and so it kind of calms everything down. It brings everything down, right? And so if you don't have that, then with glutamate and everything else going on, again, that balance that you mentioned, everything is excitatory because we don't have that inhibitory effect of GABA anymore. And so that does lead to a situation where your seizure threshold is lowered. And that's why in alcohol withdrawal, people are treated with benzodiazepines because benzodiazepines hit GABA. And so we can raise your GABA back up with the benzodiazepines, and then we can slowly taper you down to at least reduce the risk of seizures. People still have breakthrough seizures, but if you're in a medical situation or a medical environment, they can at least manage the risk and help you if you do have a seizure.
I remember when I finally decided to tell on myself to my doctor, and at that time she was just prescribing me Valium and sending me home. And I remember, okay, I'm ready to jump off this cliff. I didn't feel it right away, but I put down the alcohol, which I was chained to. Like I was always near a bottle of vodka, and it was always in my room somewhere because I was so afraid to be without it or lose it because I might lose it. All this paranoia happens when you drink daily. You just get so anxious and neurotic about so many things that I finally let it go. I cut myself off of the alcohol, and I think the next day I took my first Valium, which is a benzodiazepine. And I remember thinking, I can do this as long as I get to take these pills every day for the rest of my life. I felt that rush of calm or whatever it was treating the withdrawal. Yes. And I thought, all right, well, that's all. I just need these pills then. And so it's not something to get used to, right? It's not a long-term solution.
No, benzodiazepines are not a good long-term solution. When people are taking them for many, many years, especially at higher dosage, they can cause a whole host of their own problems. And so benzodiazepines are meant to be used in acute situations, not chronic.
Yeah, I think it took me about 1.5 years to really wean off the benzos and finally let go of them. I wasn't prescribed them, but I thought I needed them every day. And I felt a lot better when I let go of them. I felt free and let my brain finally repair itself naturally and find this new steady state of sustainable calm. That was the thing I wished for. And my deepest I had basically alcohol-induced panic disorder because I'd have panic attacks and kind of agoraphobia just thinking about leaving the house and crossing the street. I was so anxious that my prayer to whatever the universe, higher power, whatever I believed in was, please let me find this steady calm. I used to feel it when I was younger, I think, and I almost forgot what it felt like to just have enough calm, steady hands to get to work and kind of live through a shift and not fall into a panic attack somehow. And so with benzos not being a long-term harm reduction solution to alcohol, this is the last topic. I wonder about harm reduction in terms of your opinion on taking a pill like Suboxone or naltrexone. Well, not exactly naltrexone because that's more of an anti-craving, but taking an opioid for someone who's quitting heroin or fentanyl.
I am perfectly in support of Suboxone or methadone or whatever is best for an individual, and there's various reasons why one might go one route or the other. Opioids are so dangerous when you are quitting, especially, and with the potential for relapse. A lot of people die from opiates when they relapse. And if Suboxone reduces the risks associated with relapse, or makes it less likely that a person is going to return to use, I think that's amazing. We're already burying way too many people from the opioid epidemic. And if Suboxone keeps people breathing, I think it's a good thing.
And so what do you think about something like a stimulant to treat sobriety from meth or abstinence from meth?
From what I've been told, and so this is from a psychiatrist that I used to work with who was very knowledgeable on this issue. He said that stimulants for people who had stimulant use disorders were very dangerous because they usually led to relapse. That they were more likely then. So if you have, say, a meth addict who has ADHD, right? And the psychiatrist gives them Ritalin or methylphenidate or Adderall or whatever, that they're actually more likely to return to the meth than if they were not given that stimulant. And I can't cite the specific research. That was from a psychiatrist that I worked with. And so if that is true, then that makes me very nervous about using something like a stimulant as some sort of ongoing treatment for stimulant use disorders.
All right, so I can't get on Adderall for my caffeine sobriety.
They probably would not recommend that, no.
Is coffee the Suboxone of alcoholism?
It could be. And chai is my Suboxone of coffee.
And with that, we will set your attention free to the rest of your day. Thanks for listening. You can keep in touch with the podcast at justinthomascollection.com and click on the podcast tab to sign up for the mailing list or send a message. Be careful with those dopamine receptors. I'll see you next time on the Set Yourself Free podcast. Background music by Carly Thomas. Check her out at carlythomas.com. And the background of my cover is beautiful Robyn Anderson Watercolors. Follow him on Instagram.